Hi guys, today we're going to be discussing the Victorian Seance, and it's a topic that has been always something's been very interesting to me since I grew up in the UK. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of spiritual seances before. It was very popular in the Victorian era. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the timeline of the seance, how it came to be, and some of the more famous people involved with it. I think we can all agree that seances started around 1848, and a lot of people imagine that because they termed it Victorian seance, that it was predominantly happening in England. That's actually not true. The seance originated in America with the Fox sisters, Margaret and Kate. There were actually three total, but Margaret and Kate were ones who really popularized it. They were from New York, and they started the seance. So what you know today actually it originates in America, which I think is fascinating. It didn't really get to England until about 1852, but again, it was an American who really brought it to England. Her name was Maria B. Hayden, and she offered it for a very cheap price, and it became popularized and eventually caught on, and suddenly everyone was doing it. It was, especially amongst the aristocracy, it was very popular. The most famous of the mediums, I think personally, is Florence Cook. She was really starting this a little later on. It was like 1870s, thereabout, and she was famous for having a spirit guide who was called Katie King. Katie King, unfortunately, happened to look a lot like Florence Cook. She had a gimmick where she would ask herself to be tied up, usually with rope, sometimes even gagged. People would put fruit juice in her mouth to prevent her from acting like a ventriloquist, right? And so she had a cabinet in which she was tied up inside of, and then she would manifest a full form of an apparition. And the apparition had a name, and the apparition was called Katie King. Now, this apparition actually could walk around the room, could touch people, and so when we talk about the secrets of seances and what they are, when we think about seance, it's a way to communicate with the dead. Florence took it to a whole nother level, and in actually quite a sexual direction. We have reports in history where at these seances she would actually come out of a cabinet, obviously dressed all in white as Katie, and would go up and actually kiss male people in the seance. She would touch them and ask them, do you want a little squeeze and stuff like that. And that really happened. So in some ways, the seance actually became a very sexualized thing. And a lot of people would go just for the thrill of being able to touch a spirit. Like, she would say, place your hand inside of my garment and things like that. It was noted that the spirit had a very kind of low-class British accent, kind of a lot of slang in there, which also Florence had as well. So most people, definitely assume today that they were the same person. How she would escape the cabinet and change so quickly is unknown. There were a lot of experiments involving, one time they even took Florence's hair and they nailed it to the ground to make sure that she couldn't escape the box. And when they checked at the end, sure enough, she was still in there with her hair nailed to the ground. There was also a photographer, and if you look on Google, you can find these images, who took photos of her and Katie in the same instance together, but you'll notice the apparition, Katie, is often turned around, or likewise Florence is laying on a chair, but her face is hidden in any of the pictures. So it's very clever way to kind of go around it. There were obviously other mediums as well, and the thing I will say, and I know this is a theme in all of these videos that we are enjoying, is the power of a female when it comes to the occult. Mediums predominantly were female, and in fact, I think for the Victorian era, it was a nice way for women to escape the norms of society. It allowed women to really have a proper job, to have a form of independence that they hadn't previously had, which was very rare for the time. So in that respect, regardless if mediums were frauds or not, I do actually like the fact that it enabled women to have this lifestyle and to become celebrities and really, for the first time, be themselves, independent of men. Now, that's not to say that there weren't male mediums. There were. One of the most famous ones was Daniel Hume. Though you will note, he was very effeminate in his features. He kind of had long hair, if you look in pictures, and he was very soft-spoken and prone to kind of outbursts, right, which in the Victorian era they thought were characteristics reserved for females. So he became quite popular. You may know Robert Browning, who was a famous Victorian poet, and his wife Elizabeth Barrett Browning. They were both big believers in spiritualism. So they would come to the seances, and later on, Robert Browning became very skeptical, and he very much in the end got dragged. He was dragged along to these seances by his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And she really believed in Daniel Hume. In fact, they invited him to stay at their house in Florence. And unfortunately, I think there was some jealousy occurring with Robert Browning and Hume. Elizabeth really believed in spiritualism and his medium, and her husband did not. So they sat down, they did a seance one evening, and in the darkness, everyone reported seeing a pair of white, ghostly hands, and they placed a crown on top of Elizabeth's head and said, you are crowned with these laurels as a divine poet. And for those of you who know, Robert Browning was a famous British poet, as was Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He became very jealous that his wife had been crowned, this divine poet, whereas he had not. He actually reportedly tried to throw Hume down the stairs to the cries of Elizabeth saying, no, don't do it, and called him a fraud, wrote publicly, even called him, Mr. Sludge, the medium, and all sorts of terrible things like that. So, there's a lot of people who were very opposed to mediums, and a lot of people knew it was fraudulent. Another classic example of this was Houdini, who was a famous escape artist. He very much, when his mother passed, he really wanted to get into contact with his mother. So he hired some of the most famous mediums of the time. He would sit with them. He even offered a huge reward of a large sum of money to anyone who could prove to him that seances were real. And of course, a lot of people came forward attempting to prove to him it was real or trick him as he saw it. And one of his good friends at the time was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his wife. She did something called automatic handwriting. Automatic handwriting is the concept that spirit channels through you and you're writing whatever they are communicating to you on the paper, usually with your eyes closed, and then that sends a message. Unfortunately, for her, what she didn't realize that Houdini knew was that his mother spoke very little English. Also, on the day of the seance, it was his birthday rather, and he was certain that his mother would say happy birthday, right? And of course, she wrote the writing in English, and there was nothing about his birthday whatsoever. So he was furious. He publicly slandered Arthur Conan Doyle and his wife and said they were frauds, even though they were good friends, and really damaged his reputation. And as a result, Arthur Conan Doyle really believed in spiritualism. There were photographs taken in England of a young girl with fairies, you may know it, and most people knew at the time it was fake, but he really believed in it, and that kind of ruined a lot of his reputation as a writer doing Sherlock Holmes. However, he was very careful in that when he did his writing, he always separated his spiritualism from the writing. So if you've read any of the Sherlock Holmes books, including things like The Sussex Vampire, you'll notice that he definitely keeps the paranormal in a skeptical light and never admits his true feelings as the author that he really believed in spiritualism. In fact, to the day he died, he believed in spiritualism. There are other things that occur in seances. They have this thing called table rapping, so we hear a knock on the table to communicate from the spirits. Obviously, we talked about the automatic handwriting. When we talk about Hume, the chap who was with Robert Browning, he was accused of being a mesmerist. And there was this chap called Anton Mesmer who created this. A lot of people think that mesmerism is similar to hypnotism. Mesmerism actually came first, and hypnotism was a branch that was created by a Scottish chap later as an offset of that. And it would do things that you would find in a seance anyway, passing, where you run your hand across something, or the laying of the hands, where you touch someone to either cure them or make them kind of feel better. And a lot of people believed in it. In fact, Charles Dickens, who was a huge skeptic of seances, did actually become a doctor of mesmerism. That is a true story. Other famous people attended seances and really believed in it. You might be surprised to know that Queen Victoria actually did attend seances. In fact, we say that seances became popular in England in 1952. We actually know for a fact that in the 1840s, Queen Victoria and her husband Albert conducted a seance at Osborne House in the Isle of Wight. So there was actually some popularity before the 1850s in England for seances. Going back to Charles Dickens, who was a huge skeptic, obviously, while he was alive, people often claimed, I think it was 5 days after he died, that he showed up in a seance in New York and desperately wanted one of his unfinished novels to be finished. So people used to like the idea of conveying messages, whether it was from celebrities of the time or people in history who were well known. I think today, obviously, we know a lot of the seances were gimmicks. There were a lot of trapdoors, and obviously people, like with Katie, wearing white gowns and all the sexual side of it there. But today we still do have a sense of seances. In fact, a friend of mine, Aidan Sinclair, does do kind of like a mixture between a modern magic show, or let's say stage illusion, paranormal illusion, and a classic Victorian seance. So if you're ever interested in experiencing the kind of the vibe of what a Victorian seance might have felt like, you can go to the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, and he actually does do a seance. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video today, and again, write below how you feel about seances. I personally find it to be a fascinating topic, real or not. I think it did a lot for women's rights, surprisingly, and overall I just genuinely enjoy it. I would love to host a seance one day, and if I did, would you come? Let me know. Thank you guys. Take care.